I had gone to London to hear David Daniels sing the British premiere of my song cycle on poems by James Joyce. And it was a fantastic performance. Martin Katz played the piano, and he's one of the greatest. And then I went backstage afterwards to greet David, and a tall gentleman came in and introduced himself as John Cox. I didn't know John, but he said he was an opera director, and I should have known that, but I didn't, not being that associated with the opera world at that time. And then John said, "Have you ever written an opera?" He told me he had really loved the song cycle, and I said, "No, but I would certainly like to write one for David." And he said, "Well, here's my card. If you're interested in discussing this more, please be in touch." So after I determined that this is something I really wanted to do, I called David, who was living in Washington at the time, and said, "David, John Cox and I have been talking about maybe writing an opera for you. Would you be interested?" And he said, "Well, let's talk." So I flew down to Washington. David and I had a chat, and we tried to figure out what would be a good subject for an opera for him. He's a countertenor, and he sings in the mezzo-soprano range. It so happens that Max Beerbohm, one of Oscar's famous friends, said that Oscar had a mezzo voice, a very expressive mezzo voice. And I thought, oh my golly, that's just the right thing for David. And the subject is something that David was very excited about. And I got to know this man, John Cox, and found that he was really a poet. And he had been an opera director all his life, and he's become my mentor in stagecraft, in writing music for the stage. And he has been a rigorous and demanding mentor, and I've learned so much. I'm 74 years old and very happy to be in school, as it were, with this great and wonderful opera person. One of the things that I think might be interesting to anyone who's looking at this is the fact that this has become a kind of trio of people, John and David and me, working together. And that means that all along the way, over these several years that we've been working on Oscar, I have been playing sections to David and working with him closely and changing things that he wanted to have changed, and consulting John in the process. Well, Walt Whitman begins the opera and introduces Oscar Wilde and the story. He's something like a Shakespearean chorus. At the end of the prologue, Oscar says, "What lies before you is my past." He's infamous by then from having been accused of gross indecency, which simply meant homosexual love at that time. And then the scene jumps to the London streets, where Oscar is an ostracized man from society, looking for rooms in hotels, can't find a hotel that will take him. And he winds up in the home of Ada Leverson, who was one of the great literary figures of the time. And so she invites Oscar to wait out his time for the trial in her nursery apartment, because her child, Violet, was in the country with her husband. So Ada Leverson becomes a major figure here. And she and Oscar have wonderful discussions, and some of which are light and some of which are very deep and predictive of what's going to happen to Oscar. And I just love Ada Leverson. She wrote 6 novels, was a fantastic woman. Very deep and beautiful person. Very strong exterior, very big heart. Another character that we've brought into the first act who comes to visit Oscar is Frank Harris. Frank Harris is our tenor, and he will be played by William Burden, a wonderful tenor. And Frank has a very rough exterior. He was editor and owner of the Saturday Review in London by his early 30s, was brilliant, was multilingual, had also traveled to America and became a cowboy, and then traveled throughout the world, learned many languages, read constantly, and became one of the great literary figures in the time of Oscar Wilde's trial. We also have taken Lord Alfred Douglas, who's called Bosie, who was Oscar Wilde's great love, and we brought him into the story as a dancer, so that he never speaks. He's always a figment of Oscar's imagination, and he dances in very different costumes for different purposes. But underneath these costumes is Bosie Douglas. And Oscar Wilde said, if you give a man a mask, he will tell you the truth. So there will be a series of masks that work along with this. And near the end of the act, Ada is waiting for news of the results of the trial. Frank Harris arrives, and he's in a furious diatribe. He tells what had happened in the trial. The conviction, the hanging judge who gave the maximum sentence, and so forth. What we do on the stage is have the nursery explode into the Old Bailey during Frank's diatribe. And there is a black farce in which the judge arrives costumed as a clown. The jury arrive one by one, scampering on the stage as costumed as puppets, toys, dolls, and so forth. The sort of thing one would find in a nursery. And then Oscar Wilde is brought in a solemn procession. And he seems to be the only sane person in the room. The jury convicts Oscar Wilde. The judge sentences him to 2 years of hard labor, which in some accounts, some prisoners thought was worse than a death sentence because it was so brutal. So the end of the first act is the conviction and the sudden blackout at the end of this farcical trial. Then we go to intermission. Walt Whitman comes in and announces that we are in Reading Jail and what was about to happen. Then at the end of his short aria, which describes those events, the scene suddenly moves to Oscar being brought in chains, still in his courtly attire, and begins to go through the process of being prepared for his imprisonment. And that later he writes the Ballad of Reading Jail based on that extension of his compassion. And he meets a lot of poor people who are in jail with him and people who are uneducated. That also deepens his view of other people and the intensity of his feelings of compassion. And I was very moved by that, and John too, when we were reading about this. This scene is a major event in the opera and will bring the audience to a new level of understanding of Oscar Wilde and maybe even some other new understandings, and we hope so. David had said to me long before this, when we were trying to find a subject, he said, I want it to be something that will have a lot of meaning to contemporary society. And really, what would have more meaning than this story in this country at this time? So it's a really good connection, it seems to me. I'm not going to tell you the ending. The ending will involve many surprises. And so we'll let whoever is watching this hang on to what we've just said. We don't deal with his death. Something else happens. And I think the audience will be very happy with what happens at the end. Oscar Wilde is a great man. We present him not as a victim, we present him as a hero. Oscar is my very first opera. Hope it's not my last. What I have learned about making an opera is not only what I've learned from David and John, it's also what I've learned from the Santa Fe Opera and from the marvelous administration here and how devoted they are to getting the highest artistic product they can. And so they have spared no means to make this an important event, and I feel humbled, honored, and thrilled that this is happening.